This old man deserves to lose everything. He's so useless, he can't even keep a job," my son-in-law shouted at the hearing over my late daughter's inheritance. That's when the judge stood up. "I've known him for 12 years. He's the most respected judge in the county." Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. The rain hadn't stopped since we buried Eliana 3 days ago. I stood at my kitchen window watching droplets streak down the glass, each one carrying away another piece of my heart. 57 years old, and I felt ancient. My daughter, my only child, was gone, and with her went the light that had kept me going since my retirement from the bench 2 years ago. The house felt impossibly empty. Every corner held memories of Eliana's laughter, her weekend visits, the grandchildren running through these halls. Now there was only silence, broken occasionally by the distant sound of Mark's voice echoing from the living room where he'd been making phone calls all morning. "Yes, that's right," I heard him saying, his tone sharp and businesslike. "The funeral was yesterday. We need to discuss the assets immediately." Assets. That's how he referred to everything that had belonged to my daughter. Not memories, not keepsakes, but assets to be divided and claimed. I walked into the living room, still wearing the same black suit from the funeral. Mark looked up from where he sat at Eliana's old writing desk, papers spread before him like he owned the place. His expression shifted when he saw me, that familiar mix of impatience and barely concealed contempt. "Michael," he said, not bothering to end his phone call properly, "we need to talk." I settled into my worn leather chair, the one Eliana had bought me for Father's Day 5 years ago. "What about, Mark?" He leaned back, studying me with those cold blue eyes that had never shown me anything but calculation. "About the will, about what happens next." Eliana's will was clear, I said quietly. "Half of everything goes to the Children's Education Fund, the other half to me to help with their care when they visit." Mark's laugh was sharp, humorless. "When they visit? Michael, let's be realistic here. You're not equipped to take care of 2 young children. Hell, you can barely take care of yourself." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been caring for myself just fine, thank you very much. But grief had a way of making everything feel harder, more overwhelming. "Tommy is 8, Sarah is 6, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "They need stability right now. They need family. They need someone who can actually provide for them," Mark shot back, his voice rising. "Someone with a steady income, a future. Not some old man living off Social Security." I felt my hands tremble slightly. The truth was, my pension as a retired judge was quite comfortable, but I'd never felt the need to flaunt my financial security. Mark had always assumed the worst about my situation, and I'd never corrected him. Maybe that had been a mistake. "I can provide for them," I said, but even to my own ears, the words sounded weak. Mark stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "Look at this place, Michael. Look at yourself. When's the last time you even left the house? When's the last time you did anything meaningful with your life?" Each question felt like another nail in my coffin. Since retirement, I'd lived quietly, contentedly. I read, I gardened, I spent time with Eliana and the grandchildren. I hadn't realized how that might look to someone like Mark, someone who measured worth by productivity and public recognition. "The children barely know you," he continued, his voice gaining momentum. "They're more comfortable with me, with my routine, my lifestyle. I can give them opportunities you never could." "They're my grandchildren," I managed to say, though my voice cracked. "And they're my children," Mark replied coldly. "And I won't let them suffer because of some sentimental attachment to a grandfather who has nothing to offer them." The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths and old resentments. I'd never liked Mark, not from the moment Eliana brought him home 6 years ago. There was something about his smile that never reached his eyes, something about the way he calculated every interaction for maximum benefit. But Eliana had loved him, or thought she did. And she'd been so happy when the children came along. I'd kept my reservations to myself, played the role of the supportive father and grandfather. Now, sitting in my own living room while my son-in-law dismantled my relationship with my grandchildren, I wondered if my silence had been cowardice rather than wisdom. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked finally. Mark's smile was triumphant, like a predator who had cornered his prey. "I'm proposing we be practical. You sign over your portion of the inheritance to me, for the children's benefit, of course. In return, you can visit them occasionally under supervision to make sure the arrangements are working for everyone." Supervision? The word tasted bitter in my mouth. "Just until we're sure you're stable. Grief affects people differently, Michael. I'm just looking out for everyone's best interests." I stared at him, this man who had married my daughter, who had given me grandchildren, who was now systematically stripping away everything that mattered to me. The worst part was how reasonable he made it sound, how he wrapped his cruelty in concern. "I need time to think," I said. "Of course," Mark said, already gathering his papers. "But don't take too long. The children need certainty, and I won't let them suffer while you make up your mind." After he left, I sat in my chair for hours, watching the rain continue its relentless assault on my windows. The house felt colder somehow, as if Mark had sucked all the warmth from it with his presence. I thought about calling someone, but who? My few remaining friends from my years on the bench had their own lives, their own families. I'd always been a private man, keeping my professional life separate from my personal one. Now that privacy felt like isolation. The photograph on the side table caught my eye. Eliana holding newborn Tommy, her face radiant with joy and exhaustion. She'd been so proud to be a mother, so determined to give her children everything she'd never had. Would she want me to fight for them, or would she want me to step aside if it meant they'd be better provided for? The questions swirled in my mind as darkness fell outside. I didn't have answers, but I had a growing certainty that Mark's version of better provided for had nothing to do with love and everything to do with control. And somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the grief and the doubt, a small flame of anger began to burn. 3 weeks after our conversation, Mark's true nature began to reveal itself in ways I never could have imagined. It started small, comments made to neighbors, subtle suggestions planted in conversations with Tommy and Sarah's teachers, carefully orchestrated encounters designed to make me look incompetent. I first noticed it at the grocery store. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 houses down and had always been friendly, suddenly seemed uncomfortable when she saw me in the cereal aisle. "Oh, Michael," she said, her smile forced and pitying. "How are you holding up? Mark mentioned you've been having a difficult time." "I'm managing," I replied, confused by her tone. "It's hard, but I'm getting by." She nodded too enthusiastically, the way people do when they think you're not quite grasping reality. Of course, we all grieve differently. Mark seems so worried about you, though. Such a caring son-in-law." That afternoon, I called Tommy and Sarah, something I'd done every day since the funeral. But this time, Mark answered instead of letting the children pick up. "Michael," his voice was carefully modulated, speaking to me like I was a fragile, elderly patient. "I think it might be better if we limited the phone calls for a while. The children are still adjusting, and these daily conversations are just reminding them of their loss. But they're my grandchildren," I protested. "They need to know I'm here for them." "They know you love them," Mark said, his tone patronizing. "But what they need right now is stability and routine. I'm sure you understand." I didn't understand. What I understood was that my lifeline to Tommy and Sarah was being severed, one call at a time. The next blow came when I tried to attend Tommy's soccer practice on Saturday. I'd been going to his games and practices for 2 years, cheering from the sidelines, bringing oranges for the team. But when I arrived at the field, Mark was there with several other parents, and the conversation died as soon as they saw me. "Grandpa Mike," Tommy ran over, his face lighting up with genuine joy. For a moment, my heart soared. At least the children hadn't been completely poisoned against me. But Mark was there in seconds, his hand firm on Tommy's shoulder. "Remember what we talked about, buddy? Grandpa is still very sad about Mommy. We need to give him some space to feel better." Tommy's face fell, confusion replacing joy. "But I want to talk to Grandpa." "I know you do," Mark said, his voice gentle but firm. "But sometimes grown-ups need time alone when they're hurting. You don't want to make Grandpa more sad, do you?" I watched my grandson's internal struggle, saw the moment when Mark's manipulation won. Tommy stepped back, his small hand slipping away from mine. "Maybe next time, Grandpa," he said quietly, and my heart shattered all over again. As the days passed, Mark's campaign intensified. He began showing up at places where he knew I'd be: the hardware store, the diner where I sometimes had breakfast, even the library. Always friendly, always concerned, always ready with some story about my concerning behavior for whoever would listen. He just seemed so lost. I overheard him telling the pharmacist while I waited in line. Eliana was his whole world, you know? I'm worried he might not be thinking clearly these days. Oh, the pharmacist glanced at me with new eyes, sympathy mixed with wariness. When I approached the counter to pick up my blood pressure medication, she spoke to me with the careful enunciation reserved for the elderly and confused. But the worst came 2 weeks later, when I received a call from Sarah's teacher, Mrs. Henderson. "Mr. Collins," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I wanted to discuss Sarah's recent behavior at school." My heart raced. "Is she okay? Is she hurt?" "She's not hurt, but she's been having some emotional difficulties. She's been telling the other children that her grandfather is sick and can't take care of himself. She seems very worried about you." The room spun around me. What exactly did she say? Mrs. Henderson hesitated. "She said her daddy told her that you forget things now, and that you can't cook for yourself, and that you talk to her mommy even though her mommy is gone. She's quite distressed about it." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white. "None of that is true." "I'm not making any judgments, Mr. Collins," she said quickly. "But perhaps it would be helpful if you and Mr. Davis could come in together to discuss how to help Sarah process her grief in a healthier way." After I hung up, I sat in stunned silence. Mark had weaponized my grandchildren's innocence against me. He'd filled their young minds with lies about my mental state, making them afraid of the grandfather who loved them more than his own life. That evening, I tried to call them again. This time, Sarah answered. "Hi, Grandpa," she said. But her voice was different, cautious, worried. "Hello, sweetheart. How was school today?" "It was okay." A pause. "Grandpa, are you sick?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "No, honey, I'm not sick." "Why would you think that?" "Daddy said you might be confused sometimes because you miss Mommy so much. He said we should be extra gentle with you." I closed my eyes, feeling tears threaten. "Sarah, I want you to know that Grandpa is okay. I'm sad about Mommy just like you are, but I'm not confused. I remember everything perfectly." "But Daddy said—" "What did Daddy say, sweetheart?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He said you might think Mommy is still here sometimes, that you might talk to her like she can hear you." The lie was so specific, so calculated, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Mark had crafted a narrative that painted me as a delusional old man lost in grief, talking to ghosts. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully," I said, struggling to keep my voice calm. "I know Mommy is gone. I know she can't hear me when I talk about her. But I do talk about her sometimes, because I want to remember all the wonderful things about her. That's different from thinking she's still here." "Oh." She sounded relieved but still uncertain. "Daddy said we shouldn't ask you about Mommy, because it makes you too sad." Another manipulation. Mark was isolating me from the children's grief process, making them afraid to share their feelings with the one person who loved their mother as much as they did. Before I could respond, I heard Mark's voice in the background. "Sarah, who are you talking to?" "Grandpa Mike," she said, and I could hear the caution creeping back into her voice. "Sarah, remember what we talked about. Grandpa needs his rest." The phone was taken away before I could say goodbye. That night I couldn't sleep. I paced my house, fury and helplessness warring in my chest. Mark wasn't just trying to take away my inheritance, he was systematically destroying my relationship with my grandchildren, poisoning their minds against me with lies and half-truths. The man I'd watched marry my daughter, the father of my grandchildren, was revealing himself to be something monstrous. He was stealing not just money, but love, memory, and connection. He was erasing me from their lives, while making them believe it was for their own good. As I stood in my darkened living room, staring at the family photos that lined the mantel, a cold clarity settled over me. Mark thought he knew exactly who he was dealing with, a broken, grieving old man with no resources and no fight left in him. He was about to discover just how wrong he was. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who looked apologetic as he handed me the thick envelope. My hands trembled slightly as I read the petition filed by Mark Davis, requesting a competency hearing to determine my fitness to manage the inheritance left by my daughter. The allegations were devastating in their calculated cruelty. According to the document, I was suffering from significant cognitive decline, exhibiting delusional behavior, and posed a potential risk to the minor children in my care. Mark had gathered what he claimed was evidence, statements from neighbors about my erratic behavior, reports from shopkeepers about my confusion, and most damaging of all, testimonies from Tommy and Sarah's teachers about concerning things the children had said. Each lie felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Mark had spent weeks building this case, carefully planting seeds of doubt in every corner of my small community. Now, he was ready to harvest the crop of my public humiliation. I called the court clerk to ask about the hearing date, next Thursday at 2 o'clock. Less than a week to prepare for what felt like a trial for my very existence. That afternoon, I drove to the office of Janet Wilson, the only lawyer in town I could afford on short notice. She was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. But when I explained my situation, those eyes filled with something that looked dangerously close to pity. "Mr. Collins," she said carefully, reviewing the petition Mark had filed. "These are serious allegations. Do you have any medical documentation that could counter his claims? Recent cognitive assessments, perhaps?" I shook my head. "I haven't seen a doctor in months except for routine blood work. I've never had any cognitive issues." She nodded, making notes. "What about character witnesses? People who can testify to your mental acuity?" That's when the full extent of Mark's strategy became clear. He'd systematically isolated me from anyone who might speak on my behalf. My neighbors had been fed a steady diet of concerns about my mental state. The few acquaintances I had in town had been given similar stories. Even my doctor's office had received a call from Mark expressing worry about my recent changes in behavior. "There might be a few people," I said weakly, but even as I spoke, I realized how pathetic it sounded. Janet leaned forward, her expression gentle but realistic. "Mr. Collins, I have to be honest with you. Cases like this often come down to perception and presentation. Your son-in-law appears to have been very thorough in building his case. So you think I'm going to lose?" She hesitated. "I think you're facing an uphill battle. The court's primary concern will be the best interests of the children. If Mark can demonstrate that he's providing stability while raising questions about your capacity..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. I was walking into a massacre, and we both knew it. The days leading up to the hearing passed in a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. I tried to prepare, to think of ways to counter Mark's allegations, but every angle seemed blocked. He'd played this game with the skill of a master manipulator, and I'd been too grief-stricken to see it coming. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed in my best suit, the same black one I'd worn to Eliana's funeral. The irony wasn't lost on me that I might be burying more than my daughter today. The courthouse was small, typical of our rural county. I'd been here countless times before, but never as a defendant fighting for my reputation and my relationship with my grandchildren. The familiar hallways felt foreign now, threatening. Mark arrived with his own lawyer, a sharp-dressed man from the city, who looked like he specialized in these kinds of character assassinations. They sat at their table with confidence, surrounded by neat stacks of documents and evidence. I took my seat next to Janet, trying to ignore the curious stares from the handful of people in the gallery. Mrs. Patterson was there, along with several other neighbors. They weren't here to support me. They were here for the show. Judge Harrison called the court to order. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with the serious demeanor of someone who had seen too many family disputes tear lives apart. "This is a petition for competency evaluation," he announced, filed by Mark Davis regarding the mental capacity of Michael Collins to manage inheritance assets and maintain appropriate contact with minor children. Mark's lawyer stood up, his voice smooth and professional, as he outlined their case. He painted a picture of a man in rapid decline, overwhelmed by grief, disconnected from reality, and potentially dangerous to young children. Your Honor, Mr. Davis's only concern is for the welfare of his children who have already suffered the devastating loss of their mother. The evidence will show that Mr. Collins has exhibited increasingly erratic behavior, including talking to his deceased daughter as if she were present, forgetting basic daily activities, and making inappropriate statements to the children about their mother's death. Each allegation felt like a slap. I wanted to stand up to shout that none of it was true, but Janet placed a restraining hand on my arm. The first witness was Mrs. Patterson. She took the stand nervously, but her testimony was damaging nonetheless. I've known Michael for 8 years, she said, glancing at me with what might have been genuine regret. Since his daughter's death, he's been different. I've seen him standing in his yard talking to no one. And just last week I heard him in his kitchen having a full conversation, but when I looked, he was completely alone. My heart sank. I remembered that day. I'd been making Eliana's favorite soup recipe, talking aloud about how she'd always added too much salt. It was a normal part of my grieving process, but through Mrs. Patterson's eyes, filtered through Mark's suggestions, it sounded like delusional behavior. The next witness was Tommy's soccer coach, a man I'd always thought respected me. Mr. Collins used to be very involved, he testified, but lately he seems confused about schedules, sometimes showing up on the wrong days. And Tommy mentioned that his grandfather talks about his mother like she's still alive. Again, a misinterpretation twisted into something sinister. I'd mixed up one practice schedule, and I'd shared happy memories of Eliana with Tommy. But in this courtroom, those innocent moments became evidence of my incompetence. Mark himself took the stand, and this was when his true skill revealed itself. He spoke with a perfect balance of concern and reluctance, like a man forced to do something painful for the greater good. Your Honor, I love my father-in-law, he said, his voice heavy with false emotion. But I have 2 young children who've already lost their mother. I can't stand by and watch them be confused and frightened by their grandfather's declining condition. Can you give specific examples? Mark's lawyer prompted. Just yesterday, Sarah came home crying because Grandpa Mike told her that Mommy was watching over them from the clouds. When she asked if Mommy could see them right now, he said yes. She spent the night terrified that Mommy was watching her sleep. I felt my face flush with anger. That conversation had happened, but it was nothing like Mark described. Sarah had asked if her mother was in heaven, and I'd given her comfort in the way grieving families have for generations. Mark had twisted a moment of spiritual consolation into evidence of my delusions. And there have been other incidents, Mark continued. He's called the house at all hours, sometimes forgetting that he'd already called. He's shown up at the children's school unannounced, claiming he had appointments that didn't exist. The children love him, Your Honor, but they're starting to be afraid of him. Every word was a masterpiece of manipulation, containing just enough truth to be believable while distorting the context beyond recognition. I had called frequently, but out of loneliness and worry for the children. I had gone to the school once without an appointment, but only because I'd been worried when Tommy seemed upset on the phone. As Mark spoke, I watched the judge's expression grow more concerned. I could see him forming an opinion based on this carefully constructed fiction, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. When it was Janet's turn to cross-examine, she did her best, but the damage was done. Mark handled her questions with practiced ease, always sounding reasonable, always expressing reluctance to take these drastic steps. Mr. Davis, Janet asked, isn't it true that you've been discouraging contact between Mr. Collins and his grandchildren? Only when that contact seems to upset them, Mark replied smoothly. I would never prevent a healthy relationship between the children and their grandfather. And the inheritance? What would happen to Mr. Collins's portion if he were declared incompetent? It would be managed in trust for the children's benefit, Mark said, his tone suggesting he found the question distasteful. I have no personal interest in my father-in-law's assets. Of course he didn't. He was just a concerned father, protecting his children from their mentally unstable grandfather. When Janet called me to testify, I did my best to defend myself, but I could hear how my words sounded in that sterile courtroom. Every explanation seemed desperate. Every denial looked like further proof of my delusions. As I sat back down, I felt the weight of certain defeat pressing down on me. Mark had orchestrated this perfectly, and I had walked into his trap like the naive old man he'd convinced everyone I was. But as Judge Harrison prepared to render his decision, something unexpected happened. The courtroom door opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized him, though I couldn't quite place why he looked so determined. The judge looked up, his gavel frozen midway to the bench, and for the first time since the hearing began, uncertainty flickered across his face. The courtroom fell into complete silence as Judge Harrison set down his gavel and stared at the figure who had just entered. The man who'd walked in was tall, distinguished, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to respect. I knew I'd seen him before, but my grief-clouded mind couldn't quite place where. Mark noticed the judge's reaction and turned to see what had caused it. For the first time since this ordeal began, I saw genuine confusion flash across his face. This wasn't part of his carefully orchestrated plan. "Your Honor," the newcomer said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding attention. "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe I have relevant information regarding this case." Judge Harrison stood up, something I'd never seen a judge do in the middle of proceedings. "Chief Judge Morrison," he said with unmistakable respect. Of course, please approach the bench." Chief Judge Morrison. The name hit me like a lightning bolt, and suddenly I remembered. Robert Morrison, Chief Judge of the Superior Court, now retired. I'd worked with him for 12 years before my own retirement. We'd handled dozens of cases together, had coffee countless mornings, shared the weight of difficult decisions that affected real people's lives. But Mark didn't know any of this. To him, this was just another old man, probably another character witness for his incompetent father-in-law. Chief Judge Morrison walked toward the bench with measured steps, but his eyes found mine for just a moment. In that brief glance, I saw something that made my heart race with hope, recognition, concern, and something that looked like barely controlled anger. "Your Honor," Chief Judge Morrison said, addressing Judge Harrison, but speaking loudly enough for the entire courtroom to hear, "I couldn't help but notice that the defendant in this case is Judge Michael Collins, retired from this very courthouse." A collective gasp rose from the gallery. Mrs. Patterson's mouth fell open. Tommy's soccer coach blinked in confusion. Several people turned to stare at me with new eyes, as if seeing me for the first time. But it was Mark's reaction that I'll never forget. The color drained from his face so completely that he looked like he might faint. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. His lawyer leaned over to whisper something urgent in his ear, but Mark seemed incapable of response. "That's correct," Judge Harrison replied, his voice carrying a new tone of respect. "Judge Collins retired from the family court bench 2 years ago after 25 years of distinguished service." Chief Judge Morrison nodded gravely. "I worked with Michael Collins for 12 years. I can personally attest that he was one of the most respected judges in this county. His decisions were always thoughtful, fair, and grounded in a deep understanding of family law and child welfare." The transformation in the courtroom was palpable. The same people who minutes before had been nodding sympathetically at Mark's portrayal of me as a delusional old man were now shifting uncomfortably, realizing they'd been participants in something ugly. But Chief Judge Morrison wasn't finished. He turned to address Mark directly, and his voice carried the kind of authority that comes from decades of dealing with people who think they can manipulate the system. "Mr. Davis," he said, and Mark flinched as if he'd been struck. "I've been listening to your testimony from the hallway, and I have to say, I'm deeply concerned by what I've heard." Mark's lawyer finally found his voice. "Your Honor, while we respect Judge Morrison's position, this is highly irregular." "What's irregular?" Chief Judge Morrison interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade. is watching a competency hearing based on what appears to be a systematic campaign of character assassination against a man I've known for over a decade to be of unimpeachable character and sharp mental faculties. He turned back to Judge Harrison. Your Honor, I had coffee with Michael Collins just 3 months ago. We discussed a complex point of family law regarding custody arrangements in blended families. His analysis was brilliant, his memory perfect, and his concern for child welfare as strong as it ever was during his years on the bench. I felt tears stinging my eyes, but for the first time in weeks, they weren't tears of despair. Chief Judge Morrison continued, I came here today because someone called to tell me that Judge Collins was being portrayed as mentally incompetent. I couldn't believe it, so I came to see for myself. What I've witnessed is a travesty. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Mark sat frozen in his chair, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. His lawyer was frantically shuffling papers, probably looking for some way to salvage the situation. But the damage was done, and everyone in that room knew it. Mr. Davis, Chief Judge Morrison said, turning his full attention to my son-in-law, you've just spent the better part of an hour describing Judge Collins as confused, delusional, and potentially dangerous to children. You said, and I quote, this old man is so useless, he can't even hold down a job. Mark's face went from white to red. He opened his mouth, but Chief Judge Morrison held up a hand. For 12 years, I watched Michael Collins make decisions that affected hundreds of families. He was known throughout this courthouse for his wisdom, his compassion, and his unwavering commitment to protecting children. The idea that this man poses any kind of threat to his own grandchildren is not just wrong, it's offensive. Judge Harrison looked down at Mark with new eyes, and I could see the exact moment when he realized how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. Mr. Davis, Judge Harrison said, his voice now carrying a distinctly different tone, is there anything else you'd like to add to your testimony? Mark looked like a cornered animal. His carefully rehearsed performance had been shattered, his credibility destroyed. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I was just concerned about the children. Concerned about the children, Chief Judge Morrison repeated, and there was no mistaking the disgust in his voice. Or concerned about an inheritance? Mark's lawyer stood up quickly. Your Honor, I think we should recess to allow my client time to— Sit down, Judge Harrison said sharply. Mr. Davis, I want to be very clear about something. Perjury in these proceedings is a serious crime. Deliberately providing false testimony in an attempt to have someone declared mentally incompetent is not just illegal, it's morally reprehensible. The word perjury seemed to hit Mark like a physical blow. He slumped in his chair, all his arrogance and manipulation finally collapsed. Chief Judge Morrison turned to me, and his expression softened. Michael, I owe you an apology. I should have known something like this was happening. A man of your stature shouldn't have had to endure this kind of public humiliation. I found my voice at last. Thank you, Robert. I didn't know how to fight this alone. You're not alone, he said firmly. Then he turned back to Judge Harrison. Your Honor, I respectfully request permission to speak to the character and mental capacity of Judge Collins. Please do. Michael Collins is one of the finest men I've ever had the privilege to work with. His judicial opinions were cited in appellate courts. His commitment to families and children was legendary in this courthouse. The idea that this man is mentally incompetent is not just false. It's absurd. He paused, looking directly at Mark. What we've witnessed here today appears to be a calculated attempt to exploit a grieving man's privacy and dignity for financial gain. It's despicable. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Mark sat motionless, his dreams of easy money and control evaporating before his eyes. Judge Harrison straightened his robes and looked at the papers in front of him. When he spoke, his voice carried the finality of judgment. Based on the testimony of Chief Judge Morrison and the new information regarding Mr. Collins's professional background, I find no evidence whatsoever to support a declaration of mental incompetency. He looked directly at Mark, and his expression was cold. Furthermore, I'm ordering an investigation into the circumstances surrounding this petition. If it's determined that perjury was committed in these proceedings, charges will be filed." Mark finally spoke, his voice cracking. "Your Honor, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Judge Harrison cut him off, "was mine in taking these allegations seriously in the first place." As the gavel came down, dismissing the case completely, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I'd been carrying for weeks. The humiliation was over, the lies exposed, the truth finally revealed. But as I looked at Mark, slumped in defeat at his table, I realized this was only the beginning of the reckoning he had brought upon himself. The news traveled through our small town faster than I could have imagined. By the time I got home from the courthouse, my phone was already ringing. The first call was from Dr. Peterson, Tommy's pediatrician. "Judge Collins," he said, his voice filled with embarrassment, "I owe you a tremendous apology. Mark Davis called me last month expressing concerns about your mental state. I should never have listened to him without speaking to you directly." Similar calls followed throughout the evening. The pharmacist who'd treated me like I was confused, the librarian who'd started speaking to me in slow, careful tones, even my mailman who'd been watching me with worried eyes for weeks. One by one, they called to apologize, to explain how Mark had approached them with his concerns about my deteriorating condition. The picture that emerged was staggering in its calculated cruelty. Mark hadn't just been spreading casual doubts about my competence. He'd been conducting a systematic campaign to destroy my reputation in every corner of my daily life. He'd visited businesses I frequented, spoken to neighbors, even contacted my former colleagues to express his concerns about my mental state. But now that the truth was out, the tide was turning with remarkable speed. Mrs. Patterson showed up at my door that evening, wringing her hands and looking genuinely distressed. "Michael, I feel horrible," she said when I let her in. "Mark came to me 3 weeks ago. He seemed so worried about you, so caring. He said you'd been having episodes, talking to Eliana like she was still there. He asked me to keep an eye on you, to let him know if I saw anything concerning." I made us both tea and listened as she continued. "He made it sound like you were in danger, like you might hurt yourself or the children. He said he was worried about leaving Tommy and Sarah alone with you. I thought I was helping by reporting what I saw." "What exactly did you report, Helen?" I asked gently. She looked ashamed. "I told him about seeing you in the yard talking and about hearing you having conversations in your kitchen. But Michael, I realize now that I talked to my late husband Harold all the time. It's not crazy, it's just grief. It's how we cope." The irony wasn't lost on me. Mrs. Patterson had been manipulated into betraying a grieving neighbor, using her own grief as a weapon. Over the next few days, more people came forward with similar stories. Mark had been thorough, methodical, and convincing. He'd portrayed himself as a devoted son-in-law, struggling with the difficult decision to intervene in his father-in-law's declining mental health. But there was more to uncover, and it came from an unexpected source. Janet Wilson called me on Friday morning. "Michael, you need to come to my office immediately. I've discovered something that changes everything." When I arrived, she had a stack of papers spread across her desk and a grim expression on her face. "I've been investigating Mark's background," she said without preamble. "What I found is disturbing." She handed me a series of documents. "Mark Davis has done this before." My blood ran cold as I read through the papers. Court records from 3 different states showed a pattern that made my stomach turn. Mark had been married twice before Eliana. In each case, he'd married women with assets or family money. In each case, the marriages had ended acrimoniously, with Mark fighting for portions of inheritances or family wealth. "Look at this," Janet said, pointing to a particular document. His first wife's elderly father died 6 months after their divorce was finalized. Mark had tried to have him declared incompetent, claiming the old man was giving away money irresponsibly to his daughter, Mark's ex-wife. The parallels were chilling. The same accusations, the same strategy, the same calculated dismantling of an elderly man's reputation and relationships. His second marriage ended when his wife's mother died, Janet continued. Mark fought the will, claiming his mother-in-law had been unduly influenced. The case dragged on for 2 years before it was dismissed. I stared at the documents, pieces of a horrible puzzle falling into place. He targeted Eliana because of me, because of what he thought I might leave her. "It gets worse," Janet said grimly. "I found evidence that he was researching your background before he even married your daughter. He knew about your judicial pension, your property holdings, everything." She handed me another set of papers. "These are financial records I obtained through discovery motions. Mark has significant debts, gambling debts, credit cards, a failed business venture. He needs money, Michael. He needs it badly." The picture was becoming clear, and it was more sinister than I'd imagined. Mark hadn't just been a bad husband to Eliana, he'd been a predator who'd married her as part of a long-term financial scheme. "There's something else," Janet said. "I've been in contact with his ex-wives. They both want to testify about his pattern of behavior. Apparently, he tried the same manipulation tactics with their families. As horrifying as these revelations were, they also brought a sense of vindication. This wasn't about my failures as a father or grandfather. This was about a man who made a career out of exploiting families in their most vulnerable moments." That afternoon, Chief Judge Morrison called with more disturbing news. "Michael, I've been looking into this Mark Davis character. The district attorney is very interested in what happened at that hearing. They're considering charges not just for perjury, but for attempted fraud." "Fraud? Think about it," Robert said. "He systematically created false evidence to have you declared incompetent with the goal of gaining control of your inheritance. That's fraud, plain and simple. And if they can prove he's done it before," the weight of what he was suggesting hit me. Mark might be facing serious criminal charges, but the most important development came that evening when my phone rang and I heard a small voice I'd been desperately missing. "Grandpa Mike? Tommy!" My heart leaped. "How are you, buddy?" "I'm okay. Grandpa, Daddy's been acting really weird. He's been on the phone a lot and he seems scared. And some people came to the house to ask him questions." My chest tightened. "What kind of people?" "They had badges, like police, but not police. They talked to Daddy for a long time, and then he started yelling after they left." Sarah's voice came on the line. "Grandpa, we heard Daddy talking to someone on the phone. He said bad things about you, but I know they're not true. You're not sick, are you?" "No, sweetheart, I'm not sick. We want to come see you," Tommy said. "We miss you so much, and we miss Mommy. And talking to you about Mommy made us feel better." Tears burned my eyes. "I miss you too, both of you, more than you can imagine." "Daddy said we couldn't talk to you because it made you sad," Sarah said. "But talking to us doesn't make you sad, does it?" "No, honey. Talking to you makes me happy. It makes me feel close to your Mommy." I heard whispering in the background. Then Tommy came back on the line. "Grandpa, we're scared. Daddy's been different since Mommy died. He gets angry a lot, and he says things about you that don't sound right." Before I could respond, I heard Mark's voice in the background, sharp and angry. "Who are you talking to?" The line went dead. I sat holding the phone, my heart breaking for my grandchildren. They were caught in the middle of Mark's schemes, confused and frightened by the chaos he'd created in their lives. But as I thought about everything I'd learned, about Mark's history, his debts, his pattern of predatory behavior, I realized that the children weren't the only victims. Eliana had been too. My daughter had married a man who'd seen her not as a person to love, but as an asset to exploit. The grief I'd been carrying began to transform into something else, a fierce determination to protect my grandchildren from the man who had already taken so much from our family. Mark had underestimated me from the beginning, seeing only a grieving old man who could be easily manipulated and discarded. He'd built his entire strategy on the assumption that I was powerless, friendless, and broken by loss. But as I sat in my quiet house, surrounded by the memories of my daughter and the love I felt for my grandchildren, I knew that Mark's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating my mental capacity or my connections. His biggest mistake was thinking that a father's love could be defeated by lies. 6 months later, I stood in my backyard watching Tommy and Sarah chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Their laughter filled the summer air, a sound I'd thought I might never hear again in my own home. Sarah's giggle was so much like Eliana's at that age that it sometimes brought tears to my eyes, but they were tears of joy now, not grief. The legal proceedings had moved swiftly once the district attorney became involved. Mark's house of lies had collapsed under the weight of evidence, and investigators had uncovered even more disturbing patterns in his past. 3 ex-wives, 2 elderly victims from previous schemes, and a trail of financial fraud that stretched back nearly a decade. The perjury charges were just the beginning. Mark was ultimately convicted of attempted fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. He'd been sentenced to 4 years in prison, but more importantly for Tommy and Sarah, he'd lost all parental rights. The judge in the custody hearing had been particularly harsh, noting that a man who would psychologically manipulate children against their grandfather had forfeited any claim to be called a father. "Grandpa," Sarah called out, running toward me with a mason jar containing 2 blinking fireflies. "Look what I caught." "Beautiful, sweetheart," I said, kneeling down to her level. "What are you going to do with them?" "Let them go, of course," she said matter-of-factly. "Mommy always said beautiful things should be free." My throat tightened with emotion. Eliana had indeed said that many times. These children carried pieces of their mother in their words, their gestures, their generous hearts. Tommy joined us, his own jar glowing with captured light. "Grandpa, can we stay up late tonight, please?" "Well," I said, pretending to consider it seriously, "I suppose Friday night might be a good night for staying up late. What do you think we should do?" "Tell stories about Mommy," Sarah said immediately. "And eat ice cream for dinner," Tommy added hopefully. I laughed, a sound that still surprised me with its lightness. Ice cream for dinner might be pushing it, but how about ice cream after a very small dinner? They cheered and ran off to release their fireflies, chattering excitedly about the evening ahead. I watched them go, marveling at how resilient children could be when given the chance to heal. The custody transition hadn't been easy. Tommy and Sarah had been confused and frightened by their father's arrest, struggling to understand how the man who was supposed to protect them had been hurting their family in ways they couldn't comprehend. We'd spent many nights talking through their fears, their anger, and their grief, not just for their mother, but for the father they'd thought they knew. Dr. A. Martinez, the family therapist we'd been seeing, had warned me that the children might have trust issues, that they might struggle with the concept of family loyalty after being caught in Mark's web of manipulation. But as the weeks passed, something beautiful had emerged from the ruins of their shattered world, a deeper understanding of what real love looked like. "Grandpa loves us because we're us," Sarah had said during one of our sessions, "not because he wants something from us." It was a profound observation from a 6-year-old, and it had brought me to tears right there in the therapist's office. Now, as I prepared dinner for my grandchildren, a simple meal of spaghetti and meatballs that they could help make, I reflected on how much had changed. The inheritance that Mark had fought so viciously to control was now safely managed in trust for Tommy and Sarah's futures. But more importantly, they had something no amount of money could buy. They had a grandfather who loved them unconditionally, and they knew it. The phone rang as I was setting the table. It was Chief Judge Morrison, who'd become not just a colleague again, but a true friend. "Michael, how are things going with the kids?" "Better every day, Robert. They're remarkable, so much stronger than I gave them credit for." "That's wonderful to hear. Listen, I wanted to let you know that the State Judicial Council has asked me to speak at their conference next month about elder abuse in family court proceedings. They want to use your case as an example of how manipulation tactics can fool even experienced judges." I considered this. What would that involve? Just sharing the facts of what happened, how Mark was able to create such a convincing false narrative. It might help other judges recognize the signs of systematic character assassination. The idea of making something positive come from our ordeal appealed to me. I'd be willing to participate as long as it might prevent this from happening to someone else. I hoped you'd say that. You know, Michael, what you went through was terrible, but the way you handled it, your dignity, your restraint, your focus on the children's welfare, it's been inspiring to watch. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about dignity and restraint. The truth was, there had been moments during those dark weeks when I'd wanted to lash out, to fight Mark's cruelty with anger of my own. But something Eliana had said to me years ago had held me back. "Dad, the way you handle conflict teaches people how to treat you." She'd been right. By maintaining my dignity, even when Mark was systematically destroying my reputation, I'd eventually force the truth to surface. By focusing on love instead of revenge, I'd shown Tommy and Sarah what real strength looked like. "Grandpa," Tommy's voice interrupted my thoughts. "Can we start cooking now?" The next few hours passed in a blur of flour-covered counters, sauce-splattered aprons, and endless questions about everything from why onions make you cry to whether Mommy could see them making dinner. We made a magnificent mess, told increasingly silly stories, and laughed until our sides hurt. Later, as we sat on the front porch eating ice cream and watching the stars emerge, Sarah curled up against my side. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "are you happy now?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean, sweetheart? You used to look so sad all the time, but now you smile more. Are you happy that we live with you?" I set down my ice cream and pulled both children closer. "Sarah, having you and Tommy here with me is the best thing that's happened to me since your mommy was little like you are now." "Even though we're a lot of work?" Tommy asked with a grin. "Especially because you're a lot of work," I said, ruffling his hair. "That's how I know you're really living here, not just visiting." As we sat there together, 3 generations united by love and loss, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. The pain of losing Eliana would never completely go away, but it had been transformed into something else, a fierce protectiveness for her children, a deeper appreciation for the time we had together, and an understanding that love really was stronger than any attempt to destroy it. Mark had tried to take everything from us: money, dignity, family bonds, even the children's trust in their own perceptions. He'd nearly succeeded, using our grief as a weapon against us and exploiting the very love that made us vulnerable. But in the end, love had won. Not because it was easy or because it conquered all without cost, but because it endured when everything else fell apart. Tommy fell asleep against my shoulder as the night grew deeper. Sarah's breathing became slow and regular as she dozed in my lap. I sat there holding them, my heart full in a way I hadn't thought possible 6 months ago. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, homework to supervise, scraped knees to bandage, teenage years to navigate. But tonight, we were simply a family again, scarred but healing, tested but not broken. In my pocket, I carried the small silver locket that had been Eliana's, the one she'd worn on her wedding day. Inside was a picture of her as a little girl, laughing in my arms during a long-ago summer evening, much like this one. Soon, I would pass it on to Sarah, along with the stories of her mother's courage, her kindness, and her unwavering belief that love could overcome anything. As I carefully carried my sleeping grandchildren into the house and tucked them into beds that had once been guest rooms but were now unmistakably theirs, I realized that Mark's greatest failure hadn't been underestimating my strength or my connections. His greatest failure had been not understanding that some bonds are unbreakable, no matter how much someone tries to destroy them. The love between a parent and child, between grandparents and grandchildren, between family members who choose to hold on to each other through the darkest times, that love doesn't disappear when it's tested. It becomes stronger. Standing in the hallway between their rooms, listening to their peaceful breathing, I finally understood what Eliana had been trying to tell me in those last conversations we'd had before the accident. She'd been worried about Mark, had sensed something wrong in their marriage, but she'd been afraid to act on her instincts. "Dad," she'd said during our last phone call, "promise me that if anything ever happens to me, you'll take care of Tommy and Sarah. Don't let anyone convince you that you're not capable. You're the strongest man I know." At the time, I'd thought she was just being dramatic. Now I realized she'd been giving me a mission, a purpose that would sustain me through the worst period of my life and lead me to the greatest joy I'd ever known. I had kept my promise. My grandchildren were safe, loved, and thriving. And for the first time since losing Eliana, I was at peace, the deep, quiet peace that comes from knowing you've fought the right fight and won something worth having. Tomorrow, Tommy had a soccer game, and Sarah had a friend coming over for a sleepover. There would be chaos and laughter, arguments over bedtimes, and probably at least one scraped knee to tend to. I couldn't wait.